We will move now to our first guest, Professor Irit Rogoff. In a text, Academy as Potentiality, which is a text which in many ways was formative for me when working on this conference, Irit Rogoff writes, we can learn not just from doing, but also from being. And perhaps the text which is going to be delivered today, Learning from the Future, follows ideas of that were a part of this incredible project, the Academy, that was happening also here in the Netherlands. Irit Rogoff is a writer, curator, and organizer working at the intersection of contemporary art, arts critical theory, and emergent political manifestations. She's a professor of visual cultures at Goldsmiths London University, where she heads the Curatorial Knowledge PhD program and the Global Arts MA. Rogov has written extensively on geography, globalization, and on contemporary participatory practices in the expanded field of art. A collection of recent essays, Unbounded, Limits Possibilities, will be out in 2012 with Iflux Journal Sternberg Press, and her new book, Looking Away, Participating Singularities, Ontological Communities, will be out in 2013. And so I wanted to ask you to give a very warm welcome to one of the greatest teachers of our times, Irit Rogoff.
Thank you to Gabriëlle Schleijpen and to Aneta Szyłak for the invitation. This is my first time at the Rietveld Academy, and I hope that I'll have a chance to also find out a little bit about what you're thinking, and not just bringing my thoughts here. This is a rather short presentation, and it's informed by a series of questions. So I'd like to put a few things out there, and then maybe in discussion, do we have time for discussion? Yes? Maybe in discussion return to the questions that are sort of animating what I'm trying to do. Now, I have to say that at the heart of what I'm sort of trying to articulate here, and it's kind of early days, is the question of what happens to critical terminology within the exciting moment of taking action. So one of the things that's really interested me in the last year is the sort of the privileging of the paradigm of action within the sort of cultural spheres that we all circulate in. And to put it in a slightly crude and vulgar way, the degree to which I've seen in the art world around me a kind of situation of Occupy envy, right? So a lot of let's say, festival directors and so on would really like to stage Occupy with very sort of I think, limited understanding that you can't, that this is something that emanates from a sort of series of trajectories and can't be sort of produced as a kind of performative practice. So this emergence of a very predominant action paradigm kind of leads me to think through a series of preoccupations about education, about the sort of what I call in my work ontological communities, the sort of the ability to gather and to sort of act or be collectively, sort of leads me to speculate to what happens to critical terminology within this very exciting moment of taking action. So I would say that that's the main question. I have a sort of subsidiary question, which I'm not sure I actually get to in this presentation, but it is something that worries me a lot. And that is that, as I'm sure, I'm based in London, and as I'm sure you all know, in earlier last summer, we had 3 days of very extreme riots in London. They were dealt with in a very punitive mode by the Conservative government, and they have completely exited the celebratory and critical discourse around sort of protest movements. And this is something that I find rather odd, extremely interesting. I think some of the things that I'm talking about, the role of self-education within protest movements, is probably has to do with that. Some has to do with class specificity. So there's a whole set of issues that I think many of the people that I talk to and I myself find extremely puzzling. I have some images. I'm both very, very low-tech person and have a sort of residual unease about illustration. And so these images are a bit haphazard, they're a bit arbitrary, they're not sort of really very impressive. Learning from the future. 2011. 2 countries, 2 protests, 2 tent universities, 2 questions, no answers. August. The tent occupation of the movement for social justice in Tel Aviv. The movement had started with a host of discontents over standards of living, pay, mortgages, real estate prices, food prices, etc. It was a response to the accelerated speed of capitalization of what had until recently been a welfare state. The deeper issues of the state, the occupation of Palestine, the extreme military presence in every facet of civil life, the foundational injustice of the premise of the Jewish state, seemed invisible in what was trying to be a popular movement about so-called social justice. And then a tent popped up on Rothschild Boulevard called 1948. And after that, one called the Nakba. And then another, and then another. And in these tents, a self-education project about the foundation of the state was unraveling. In a seminar in the 1948 tent, one participant says, "You've written a book about geography, about active processes of unbelonging. Can these, whatever they are, work to dismantle the occupation?" I am silent. November. The Bank of Ideas, part of the London Occupy movement, a seminar in a disused office of a financial company in the city, the financial centre of London, and in many eyes of Europe. The participants talk about agency and about empowerment, and they want to know if the terms that I have turned up with to the seminar, potentiality and singularization, are as effective. How exactly, they ask, do these terms affect the balance of power as we experience it? I am silent. This silence has not so much to do with the loss of words as with being confronted by a dilemma concerning the relation of critical terminology within the very exciting moment of taking action, or seeming to take action. The excitement of action in the case of so many of the political revolutionary movements in Iran, Tunisia, Egypt, Bahrain, Yemen. I'm not speaking of Libya and Syria, as those seem to me to be more civil wars than protest movements. And of the social justice movements in Spain, Portugal, Greece, Israel, and of the ultra-capitalist Occupy movement in the US, Canada, Britain, Italy, and elsewhere. The excitement seems to be that these are not just protest movements, but that they are actually an effort to challenge and change the terminology which dominates political discourse. And such a challenge involves a huge project of self-education, of contesting the very knowledge base from which we know, of elaborating a self-generated pedagogy that privileges questions of what we need to know right now and how we need to know it right now, and whether this knowledge we so desperately need is analytical knowledge about the crisis, how it comes about, who are its victims and who are its beneficiaries, who needs to be reformed, who needs to be made accountable. Or is there an emergent mode of crisis thinking that is coming about that is not descriptive and reactive, but generative? In particular, around the economy of crisis and the education of crisis, and at the intersection of critical economy, art, anthropology, and radical pedagogy. Instead of discussing the crisis itself, these become ways of framing and reframing critical issues, such as the one of insider and outsider, or individuals and collectivities, or legitimacies and illegitimacies, through a performative process of cultural production. In particularly, crisis thinking, as opposed to thinking about the crisis, looks at the idea of political contingency. What can we salvage in the debris of the crisis, and do we want to operate in a salvage paradigm in the first place? Can we open new temporalities out of the here and now? In what ways have concepts of potentiality and of actualization replaced older notions of agency and of empowerment? And can short-term and informal economies and regimes of labor emerge from the financial and intellectual wasteland that surrounds us? So in a way, the sort of conjunction that is operating here, along my sort of reading of it, is a conjunction of occupations and preoccupations that are sort of lending sort of theorization and inhabitation in both directions. The centrality of self-education platforms around the globe, and as part of all of these protest movements, have in effect produced one of these conjunctions that have been so difficult to predict or characterize. I have been part of the so-called educational turn in art, which is, it's not a term that I'm all that comfortable with, but for the purposes of this argument, I'll adopt it and be part of it. So I've been part of this educational turn in art for some 8 years now, through a series of exhibitions I curated and co-curated, a series of public forums and publications, but mostly through trying to theorize what I thought the implications of this educational turn were, beyond a trope that privileged gatherings and conversations and self-generating seminars and reading groups as a form of artistic and cultural practice. So one of the things that seems kind of very important to argue is that while these have somehow solidified into kind of artistic platforms within the regimes of display, I would want to argue that they are far more than kind of formal tropes that have entered the culture of exhibiting, and that their potential is far beyond that realm. One of the most interesting aspects of this turn has been the movement of ideas and critical thinking from the university out into the cultural sphere of the expanded field of art, and the invention of new platforms and new modes of dissemination for those ideas. Self-authorized night schools and free academies and reading groups and think tanks have recognized that we need to pose our questions from many different places. So one of the things that I think we need to take from this so-called turn is a recognition that it is the act of taking a question out of a context that might have helped articulate it or generate it in the first instance, and posing it from elsewhere, which both changes the nature of the question, its possibility to kind of connect with other free-floating bodies of knowledge, and to kind of operate within completely different economies of knowledge. So that posed from elsewhere, the questions acquire a freedom they might not have had, that infiltrating institutions dedicated to one practice, the display of art, with a series of active questions, changes that institution dramatically, and that we can't have one model of knowledge that fits all our needs. These platforms have been innovative and imaginative, and have focused on questions rather than on answers, on processes rather than products. Oops, sorry. In this instance, what I've brought you in order to try and slightly instantiate this process is a document that was the sort of working map for an exhibition that we did here in the Netherlands a few years ago at the Van Abbe Museum. It was part of 3 exhibitions that took place in Germany, Belgium, and the Netherlands. And were called Academy. This is a group of exhibitions that Aneta mentioned in her introduction. And this was the 3rd of them. And it operated under the aegis of what can we learn from the museum. So the main question posed here is, what can we learn from the museum beyond what the museum shows us, right? So there's a kind of assumption that what the museum shows us, whether it's art or statistics about audiences or whatever it is that the museum sort of externalizes, is not where we're going to undergo a process of learning, because that's already sort of commodified within very easily kind of tropes which have very easy points of access. Sorry, I need some water. So what we did with this project was we put together 8 teams of people, of which only 2 were artists, Edgar Schmitz and Liam Gillick. The rest were groups of philosophers and urbanists and curators and PhD students and philosophers and so on. And we asked them to pose a series of questions to the museum, sort of assuming that the real problem here is if we want to reconfigure the museum as a learning environment, one of the problems is that we don't know how to question it. So the first thing we need to do is begin to articulate a series of questions that can kind of question it. And the questions really came from people's kind of practices, with the assumption that if they ask it from the museum, then the sort of resulting question will be different, and certainly the processes by which it will kind of circulate in the world, the information that it will suture to it, will be extremely different. A lot of this kind of at least my part in the making of the work for the exhibition came back to an invitation that we extended to a very well-known Dutch museum director at Goldsmiths some years ago, who shall remain nameless, and who sort of in doing his museum director talk about 23,000 prints and 4,000 paintings and this education program and that education program, said to us with the best of intentions that one of their chief concerns was trying to get the Surinamese community of the city that the museum was located in into the museum. And this went on and on and on about all the strategies that they were using to try and get this community into the museum, and we became more and more and more embarrassed as this went on and kind of looked at our shoes, but this is kind of a good person and an ally, and so nobody wanted to say anything, and it was just about 20 embarrassing minutes of this, and finally one of the students raised his hand and said, "Excuse me, actually they're in there. They collect your rubbish, and they wash your floors, and they deliver your post, and they fix your electricity. They're in there. You just have to find a strategy of seeing them." And I thought, this is a very interesting way, for example, of entering a museum, is to kind of figure out how to see who's actually there, rather than to sort of see them through the kind of demographics and statistics that are produced for that kind of cultural institution. So the sort of question of what can we learn from the museum really extended itself to a whole, I'm interested in audiences, and one of the things that I figured out is that the kind of separations that I would have thought I might want to make between who's already there and who's coming in the form of audience is actually an unsustainable division, and that I need to kind of rethink that entire paradigm. There was a group of architects and urbanists who put together a very interesting project about think tanks, and who were sort of trying to work between 2 models of think tank. One model being the Van Abbe Museum, as I'm sure most of you know, has a very distinguished collection of Russian constructivist art, particularly work by Lisitsky. And within that, they located a kind of highly idealistic, revolutionary 1920s model of what, let's say, the Art Academy as think tank might be, as a kind of particular intensity. At one extreme, and at another extreme, what they called the conspired world, which was the Cold War think tank, the sort of think tank which in essence participated in the statecraft of governing by taking knowledges out of speculative environments and putting them into highly pragmatized environments where they would answer a set of preordained questions by governance. And so they wanted to sort of do what could not be done in any other environment, which to say the idealized art academy of revolutionary Russia in the 1920s versus the Cold War think tank that was sort of providing in essence the information and the legitimation for a whole set of modes of governing and of statecraft. So these were sort of some of the projects, and the one that I wanted to just show you very briefly is by a collective of media activists, which were brought in by Florian Schneider, Multitude EV, and they put on a project called Imaginary Property, which is now continued very extensively in the Jan van Eyck Academy in Maastricht. Now the question they were asking here is, what does it mean to own an image? They asked this because, as you can see at the center of the image, there's a small sketch by Lisitsky for a banner that was to hang outside the Vitebsk Art Academy in its foundation in 1922. The banner was never made and never hung on the Vitebsk Art Academy because Marc Chagall denounced Lisitsky for some presumed political transgression. And Lisitsky was then detained and jailed, and the project never came to fruition. So that's a whole other conversation about revolutionary politics. But the sort of this piece had been acquired by the museum, and in relation to a much larger project on copyright and on what this particular collective of media activists were calling oil of the 21st century, the economy of the circulation of information. They wanted to use the museum to ask a question about what does it mean to own an image. And so what they did was, and this is part of their installation, they did extensive interviews with everyone who had come into contact with this image. So the sort of art historians that had written about it, the people who had sold it and bought it and owned it and transported it and conserved it, and began to sort of think about the different economies that entered ownership, and ownership in relation to a kind of cultural artifact. So when my collaborator Florian Schneider and members of his media activist group asked, what does it mean to own an image? They do far more than investigate the market and the ever-rising value of objects through systems of valorization. In thinking that it is not only the dealer who sold the piece, the museum that bought it, the curator who will catalog and register it and display it, but also the restorer who conserved it, the truck driver who transported it, the student who studied it as part of their PhD dissertation, the writer who published a book about political banners and posters. All of these have an investment, partly capital, partly cultural, partly psychic, and driven by desire and possession. And that these actually redefine the notion of ownership. put very briefly, as I look at the images that come from Tahrir Square, this one, and even more so this one, and from Rothschild Boulevard that we saw at the beginning, from Bank of Ideas and the Tent University, which you see here in one of the Occupy London sites. It would seem that this movement of ideas has continued from the research university, where some of them have been conceptualized, to the art world, where innovative new platforms have produced new accesses and audiences to the realm of political protest, where people have insisted that to change conditions is to acquire new knowledge bases. Now, one of the things that, and I think the title of this conference is equally raises this, and I think it's actually quite a problematic question, is the question around the location of the present. So I'm speaking here under the aegis of what I call learning from the future, but I'm not sure about the future. I seem to so struggle with the present at every turn, or because I think the future is always already there. Gilles Deleuze famously said, "Every once in a while, the future rushes through the present like a gust of wind that disappears and leaves everything slightly disturbed within the stillness." Because I'm part of a department at the University of London where we have set our subject as contemporaneity, rather when sort of pushed to the wall and asked what is it that we actually do, we say we do contemporaneity. I've been reading some recent rather art historical books like Terry Smith and Keith Moxie around sort of the question of contemporaneity. And thinking that for me contemporaneity is never harnessed to history, but it is rather a moment of interpellation, of being hailed by a problematic or an urgency, and of locating yourself within it, like Althusser's famous argument in his essay on ideological state apparatus. But unlike Althusser's argument, or Althusser's location of interpellation, as a form of internalized disciplining authority, this form of interpellation, this notion of interpellation, is the moment in which we make a problem our own. We are the problem, and it inhabits us, and we produce the terminology with which to see it anew. So self-education is not acting in a contemporary mode, but is an instantiation of contemporaneity. Now this, of course, leads to a question concerning the collective coming together that enacts this instantiation of contemporaneity. Jean-Luc Nancy, who I've been reading quite a bit in recent years in relation to sort of work on participation and participatory practices, proceeds to take on the proper names of collectivity, we and us, and of their relation to meaning. And he does so obviously against the grain of the claims of identity and their ability to separate and to segregate. So what's very important to sort of understand about the way in which Nancy is arguing is that it is a counter-identitarian argument. It's not an argument where the sort of centrifugal force of the we or the us has anything to do with shared identity, with kinship or ideology or circumstance, right? So he's really trying to develop another notion of the we and the us that has much more to do with ontology than it does with shared belief, shared identity, or shared circumstances. He takes up the notion of meaning precisely because of this proliferation that has no other meaning than the indeterminate multiplication of centripetal meanings. Meanings closed in on themselves and supersaturated with significance, which is how people like Nancy and like Agamben at certain moments of his thinking see the notion of collectivity based on identity. They see it as closed in on itself and supersaturated with significance, that are no longer meaningful because they refer to their own closure, to their own horizon of appropriation, and have to spread, Nancy says, nothing but destruction, hatred, and the denial of existence. And this, of course, he yokes to a whole series of wars that were taking place throughout the 1990s on the sort within Europe and West Asia, and which were wars that were founded on the sort of ethnic claims, on ethnic exclusivities. And this is the moment in which he's writing texts like Being Singular Plural or The Inoperative Community, etc., which are the ones that I'm drawing on. To these ends, he has to go back to both we and meaning as the building blocks of another form of relatedness that is not founded on the articulation of identity. And this is, I apologize, it's a rather long quote from Nancy, or rather a collection of quotes that I've gathered, but there's a sort of compactness to his argument that I would rather have in his words than in mine that diffuse it. So, long quote from Nancy. We do not have meaning anymore because we ourselves are meaning, entirely, without reserve, infinitely, with no more meaning other than us. Being itself is given to us as meaning. Being does not have meaning. Being itself, the phenomenon of being, is meaning that is in turn its own circulation, and we are that circulation. There is no meaning then if meaning is not shared, and not because there would be an ultimate or first signification that all beings have in common, but because meaning is itself the sharing of being. That's the end of this quote. So the phenomenon that he is describing here, this notion of a we and an us that comes together in the contemporary, and that isn't about a whole series of claims that we have in advance of that coming together, is one that is based almost entirely on the sharing of meaning, so in the sharing of ourselves. Thinking back to the silence of those two moments in those two tents earlier this year, I begin to understand that this was not a learning and teaching situation, even though it was masquerading as a series of seminars and tent universities. It was one of witnessing. What I have been observing, witnessing, is the constitution of the coming public, one that in the demise of the classical bourgeois public sphere, in the demise of civil society public institutions under neoliberal governance, in the increasing privatization of both urban spaces and sites of education, is constituting itself in the ebbs and flows of what Nancy calls being in common, and that the political potential of this mode has only begun to be explored. Thank you.
we would like to take your questions. There is a mic for the public, yes? Or this is the one. This is the one. Okay, I will be giving this mic.
I sort of as we enter, we have what, a few minutes. I sort of want to rehearse for myself the questions that have been sort of propelling me, and they are what I said before. What happens to critical terminology within the exciting moment of taking action is one question. How does this moment necessitate a process of self-education? So I think that self-education is not just a program of what takes place within protest movements, but the very constitution of protest movement necessitates these moments of self-education. And whether this moment of self-education produces a particular crisis thinking of itself, rather than rehearsing and reflecting a whole series of crises that are kind of material and conceptual and within which we're embedded. So in a way, and then constantly at the back of my mind, why is nobody taking the London riot seriously? A question that I can only begin to speculate about and don't really have sort of any answers for. So the difference between the models with which one identifies, people risking their lives across the Middle East in order to grasp something called democracy, people risking their jobs and the weather and discomfort in the Occupy movement, and then this enormously violent sort of happening of 3 days in the summer of 2011 that nobody is identifying with. And so a whole set of structures of identification here seem to me really important. So those are kind of the questions that I'm trying to enter this field with. And secondly, and for me, a sort of quite cheering set of possibilities, which are the fact that I see a very direct set of connections between ideas that exited the university, entered the art world, got produced as a series of really innovative platforms for widening the experience of education and recasting it in other ways through institutions that were not seemingly devoted to education, and then through those innovative platforms into the arenas of social protest. So I think that one of the things, if you're moving between these worlds, this has been one of the most interesting things for me to see this year, that there's a certain kind of mutual dependence here that is at each stage. There's a kind of level of innovation that is allowing the next set of practitioners to take these up and use them and deploy them in different ways. Aneta, it seems to me, is choking in the wings, and so I will ask for questions or comments or experiences which are just as interesting. Yes.
Yeah, hello. I just want to follow this last remark of you about how such movements go through institutions, but in the end of the day, isn't it institutionalism as usual? And so with educational institutes.
I don't know, it's very hard for me to answer a question like that, or because it comes from an assumption of no change, and all my thinking always comes from an assumption of constant change. And so
Well, if you talk about self-education, you still talk about that there's a kind of contradiction here, because how do you teach how can you You're from an educative institute, so you have an institutional history and an institutional endeavor to teach people or to educate people. So there is a contradiction here.
First of all, like all of us, I come from many worlds. I'm not a citizen of one exclusive world, and operate differently in different worlds. I think that I actually do see an enormous sort of change, because I think that as knowledges kind of move around different spheres, the knowledges themselves change, and their deployment changes, and their ability to actually enact something in the world changes. And when they sort of let's say come back to the university, and we're certainly seeing that this year, there's pressure and a set of demands on them to operate very differently. And so there's a whole set of pressures and demands on knowledges to actually not operate within, let's say, disciplinary protocols or within the protocols of questions that have an academic kind of procedure built into them, but to engage with urgencies that are from elsewhere and that posit those questions differently. So for example, I teach a seminar called Geographies every year, and at the end of it, the students do a sort of big collective project. And this year, their project is called the Parrhesia Primer, and they're taking Foucault's arguments around parrhesia, the injunction to speak the truth, around kind of moments of neoliberal practice, in order to see what happens when the kind of two are juxtaposed. I don't think that a project like that could have happened before this year. So I think change comes in all kinds of forms, and it's important to, let's say, recognize and welcome its potential, rather than say, oh, it's business as usual, the institution will always close in on itself.
Okay, just maybe then for a last, I see what you mean, but in order for example, for the Van Abbe Museum to make clear that they are in a kind of different mode of knowledge production, mm-hmm. It's also important that they are a museum, because otherwise there wouldn't be, the field of difference wouldn't have been set beforehand.
I agree, but I think that then the possibility of taking designated spaces, spaces that are designated in this way or that way, and using them almost against themselves, not in order to destroy them, but in order to kind of push at their boundaries and see, what might be elicited in the sort of process of applying this pressure. I think, for example, a lot of it depends on where you're asking from. If what you're asking, are the institutions of education and culture unraveling? It's probably not. To be realistic about it, probably not. Cognitive capitalism has created ever greater strictures around institutional knowledge production. We're aware of it. But simultaneously, the way in which we practice knowledge has changed, I think, quite dramatically. If I just think about how I operate, anything that preoccupies me gets tested in 3 or 4 worlds. I don't just write a book or an article. I'll try and do this and I'll try and do that. I'll try and push it against a whole set of realities. So that might not radically destroy, the foundations of the institution, but it slightly shifts what's going on inside it, because when you come up to a class and you say, okay, here's the problem. If we think it from here, it'll look like this. If we think it from there, it'll have these pressures put upon it. The only way to think it is from a multiplicity, of demands and perspectives and so on. So I think, doesn't shake the foundations of the institution, but changes kind of encounters with knowledge.
Thank you.
I wanted to share an experience that reminded me about the talk, about all the, I used to have this thing while I was in the metro, that I knew the metro was kind of programmed that it stops, and if it stops, there's enough time to stand up and to go out. But like a lot of times, like people go up front, the metro is not yet to its stop, and it always gave me very much the feeling of also stand up. And I knew it is programmed to, that you have enough time if it stops. So, and even while I knew this, it made me very insecure. So I was almost going out of my seat, and while there was still enough time, and I just wanted to share this experience.
Thank you.
Because I think it's a nice metaphor for how we kind of, for me, how we have basic knowledge, that like when we are in the big groups, we kind of always got influenced by how other people are reacting by us. But maybe it could be.
Well, it's sort of one of the things that I didn't spend a huge amount of time in these various tent seminars in universities, but on the few occasions that I went with them, it was very clear that this was not the transmission of existing knowledge. This was knowledge in the process of being produced. It was taking place, and that it was sort of constantly shifting in relations to what people saw as urgencies. So in a way there was no metro stop to arrive at, so, to use your metaphors.
My question was about we and the others, because every time that we create a collective and we can stand on that and say we also create the others. And even with all of those movements in Middle East and also Occupy, which is totally open movement and it's inviting, but at the same time it creates bipolar situation. It creates kind of dichotomy between two totally opposite things, and then later on it's really difficult to continue that because of that huge contrast. And for instance, all of those uprising in Middle East, there are lots of people who are pro-revolution in Middle East here, but at the same time it creates people who are really like, it creates distance to other people also. My question was how we can deal with this concept of we and the others and continue this movement with inviting other people to participate, not just observe it.
Well, I think, or at least for me, sort of following this line of thought that certain philosophers have put forward, like Nancy and Agamben, about sort of non-identitarian, momentary collectivities that come into being, through being there, is very important because they cannot be characterized, right? The sort of we and the others have to have attributes in order to differentiate, right? We have to be something, and the others have to be not that thing. But if what brings you together is this kind of notion of, what Nancy calls being in common for the moment, then I think that there's a possibility, it probably never really happens, but there's a possibility of circumventing that kind of differentiation between we and the not we, right? Us and them, basically. So it's a kind of collectivity that isn't coming together through negative differentiation with other collectivities. And that's why, to me, it's such an important model. The other thing that I think is very important about it is it doesn't assume a name. It doesn't. It's about sort of fleeting intensities that sort of produce change by the sheer power of their momentary being, and that don't have a platform and a title and a set of articulated aspirations and so on. And as a result, can't be sort of incorporated into a kind of future mode of governance, for example. So it's very different. And one of the things that for me has been most interesting is to see the extent to which the environments of contemporary art and contemporary creative practice have really exemplified some of these, what I'm calling ontological communities that come into being without then using that collective being as some kind of a concretized identity. I think that the distinction between being in common and identity-based communities is a very, very important one, and it has a great deal of political potential. And one of the issues is, where can we look around and recognize it? Because it's happening all over us, all around us, but we don't always know how to read it and recognize it. So I think part of what we have to do is just kind of look around and see where ontological communities are coming into being. There was a question there, and there was one there, and you had a question. You have the mic, so you have the right.
Okay, very briefly, maybe it's an impossible question as a follow-up to what you just explained. So one of the very strong points of the Occupy movement was to refuse actually this kind of identity or name or a political program. And I want to go back to your museum kind of commentary, museums trying to redefine themselves as a new form of kind of a public space, etc., etc.
So it's a new form of
public space, or reclaim that kind of publicity that museum had, but not as a display of collections, etc., etc. So if we say that Occupy would be some sort of transported in a museum publicity, but Occupy itself is a series of fleeting intensities, a series of very precarious gestures that do not claim even materiality, then how do you see the future of those gestures? So how do you see a development?
That's not fair.
What would even a tendency?
I wouldn't sort of know how to begin to answer that. I think we are in. We're in a sort of situation where it takes all of our attention to try and differentiate between, different types of protests, and to kind of understand them as a panorama. I'm not at all sure that they're quite as ephemeral. I was looking at a lot of photographs of the People's Library from New York, from the New York Occupy movement, and I thought, this is actually not nearly as ephemeral as one thinks. There's a whole set of beginnings that I personally know of about 15 sort of self-organized education initiatives that have now moved out of Occupy and set themselves up in a variety of sort of spaces and forms in London that are continuing, for which this was the initiative. So I think that, another drive of all of these investigations that I'm sort of trying to enter has to do with the fact that I no longer know what the word public means. So there were a whole series of meanings, bourgeois public sphere, public art, public space, civil society institutions. There were public education, which has become private education. The street is one of the most zone surveyed, sort of policed kind of parametered spaces there are. So one of the things that I'm really struggling with is how to fill this evacuated term with some kind of contemporary meanings, because we need it. We need it very badly. So this notion of what a coming public is. So, you know, if you're saying occupy, direct political action, a series of protocols that will last, probably not. But if there is some possibility of slightly sort of refurnishing the notion of public, of the coming public, with some other set of meanings, then yes, I think it might have some you know, lasting value. So I think, you know, one is looking for permanence in the wrong places. Let's say that's what I'm trying to say. Okay.
I'm really glad that you brought up the London riots, because I find that it's sort of bizarre how the, say, General Assembly of Occupy is applauded constantly as this new methodology of gathering and finding a collective voice, which it is in many ways, but the riot, of course, is also a sort of form of temporal collectivity, which is usually cast as destructive, but somehow it also has a great potential for a uselessness that is relevant and a purposeful incoherence, or a sort of desperation that is visceral. And one really wonders then how those tendencies that continue to resound after the riot continue to mold our ideas, even here.
Well, I think that, you know, in a way, I've followed Occupy London much more closely than I've followed Occupy New York, and I think there are a lot of differences there. But the sort of what Occupy London is dealing with is two authorities: the Corporation of London, which owns and manages the entire area of the city, and the church. Because one of the sites of Occupy London was in Finsbury Square, which is part of the City of London, and the other was in Paternoster Square, which is in front of St. Paul's Cathedral, and that's land that's owned and managed by the church. And so there have been several set of kind of territorial, ideological, fiscal kind of authorities to deal with throughout this process. And I think that one of the things that's been really very disturbing about the riots is nobody has actually done the work of connecting it to the authorities with which it engaged. The sort of the little bit of information that has come through is just, you know, statistics about people who are unemployed, which sort of 80% of the people who were rioting were unemployed. This is then not connected to economies and so on. So there is, I think that to say that one is a kind of working class eruption, you know, in a city going through a sort of huge economic crisis, and while the other is a set of informed negotiations with the crisis, is too simple. I'm sure it's too simple, but I don't have anything much more sophisticated to add to the debate. It remains just an open question. Okay. Did you want to say something?
I guess we've been talking mostly in the present moment, and meanwhile my mind has been knitting together some things from the past. One is a book published in '76 by the Van Abbey Museum called Museum in Motion, and it itself is a study that goes back, I think, to the mid-'60s of how the Van Abbey Museum engaged with its public and what it wanted to consider the public to be, and what it did not want to consider the public to be, which it did not have the traditional look. So I'm presuming that the exhibition you were talking about in a way relates back to that specific history also of the Van Abbey Museum. But then another thing is, I was thinking about the radical education movement of the mid-60s.
Sure.
And there was a period of, especially a period of about 5 years, something very much like Tent City, of people getting together and trying to distinguish for themselves, to educate themselves about what education was, and to then also bring their children together and to educate their children, not through the school system, but through some other system. And that seemed to sort of, it got absorbed by the school system and then kind of collapsed and disappeared again. And then I also thought about be-ins and love-ins.
About?
Be-ins and love-ins.
Be-ins and love-ins.
From the 60s. So I wondered, so it's kind of like I think since we don't have much time, my real question is the be-ins and the love-ins. How do you relate that moment to this moment?
I agree with you that almost every one of the moments that I've been speaking about has a history. And that there's sort of really long lines of development over the past almost 50 years. But I think that in a way, they don't come into being through their histories. I think they come into being through a set of contemporary kind of pressures. And I think that Aneta was saying about, what was the name of your exhibition? Over and over again. I think, for example, and I've been teaching for quite a while now, and I think about how almost every year we have to re-understand the notion of collectivity within, let's say, education. And that it's never there simply to be inhabited, that it has to be remade and owned in relation to a set of contemporary sort of crises. So yes, there are these very long and very important histories, and what's very nice, for example, from my experience in students in London, or this big project that's been circulating in the Netherlands, If I Can't Dance, I Don't Want to Be in Your Revolution, is that the sort of people are really interested in these earlier practices. Like in London, there's been years now of remaking a lot of performances by feminist artists in the 70s. But I think that, that's sort of maybe how we got to here, but it's not here. And so why now?
Sorry, why now? I guess my thought is, the core of my question is why now? It's really interesting that it's suddenly...
I think I don't know how to answer that, except that I think that there's been a sort of at least a decade of not knowing how to enter the debate. So certainly amongst people that I work with who are students, the scale of global politics has been so overwhelming and so intimidating that there's been very little sense of how to enter the debate. And so I think that its fragmentation into a whole series... I think, for example, to compare the G8 movement, the Alter Globalization and G8 protests of the 90s, with what we've been seeing in the last 2 years, is precisely to see how people have found absolutely specific points of entry that are totally relevant to them, but that are not necessarily operating in the name of an identity. People have somehow, after 10 years of being overwhelmed by two large questions, I think begun to find very specific points of entry. And the self-education model that I'm talking about is particularly interesting because whereas the situation, let's say, in Egypt and Libya and Iran, and Syria and Greece and Spain and Ireland are different, there's a level, not at the level of context, but at the level of strategies of self-education that they are talking to one another. There's an amazing network at that level. So not saying we all have the same problems because capitalism has affected us all in exactly the same way, but saying we share tools. We share the ability to forge for ourselves a point of entry that we are in charge of into the debate. So I think that's as much as I can say. Where's Franco Berardi? He was here a minute ago. He's disappeared. He's probably the person to ask why now. I think he's better on now in that sense than I am. Thank you very much.